Now we can go. Good afternoon and welcome to this special seminar of the Global Futures Laboratory. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker who will come to us virtually. Unfortunately, we all would have loved to have Nick here, but the present conditions don't allow for that. Speaker is Nick Bates, who is the Director of Research and a Senior Scientist at the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences. Nick is a chemical oceanographer by training, but really looks at a variety of issues that in essence have to do with how our planet is changing under the multiple pressures we are putting on it through human activities. Specifically, Nick is actually looking at that from the marine side, and within the marine side from the carbon cycle. Now he takes observations, he looks at models, many parameters, including CO2 measurements, carbon system measurements, but also nutrients and ecosystem behavior. And what that allows him to do is to address what often is called the other CO2 problem, which is not the warming of the atmosphere, but it is the acidification of the ocean through uptake of CO2 and thereby changing the pH value of the ocean. So Nick has worked on that problem throughout his career, I think, throughout many parts of the ocean, including high latitudes, low latitudes, the area around Bermuda, and he does that from a systems perspective. In addition to serving as the Director of Research at BIOS, he's also a Professor of Ocean Biogeochemistry at the University of Southampton in the UK, there at the National Oceanographic Centre. And he's also an adjunct full professor at the University of Delaware Center for Marine and Earth Studies. Nick received his PhD from the University of Southampton in 1995. So here you see some connections that still are alive. And with that, I would like to hand over to Nick to start his presentation. Oh, by the way, before doing that, Lauren reminded me to remind you that if you have questions, you can use either the chat or the Q&A function on Zoom.
Okay. So thanks, Peter. If someone can let me know that they can see the presentation and hear my voice, thumbs up. Okay, that's great. Well, thanks to Peter for the invite to give a talk today, and to all those who organized this virtual meeting. It's a challenge, and we worked through some problems and earlier on, and it seems to work great. So, you know, I hope to be in person at ASU soon, and it would be fantastic to be there and chat in person. For this talk, I'd like to thank many people, many of my colleagues at BIOS and nationally and internationally. Oceanography really is an interdisciplinary science and relies on collaboration. And you'll see that this presentation shows that collaborative spirit. We are in, as Peter mentioned, a transitional carbon-based world where we're experiencing multiple impacts, anthropogenic, human-produced impacts on the planet's system, from climate forcing to changes in where people live, changes in hydrography, where it rains, where it evaporates, the changes in the hydrological cycle, plastic pollution in the ocean. We are really living in the Anthropocene, this new geological epoch, and experiencing global environmental change, which will have profound implications. And we have the challenge to move this planet from a transitional to a post-carbon world, and a future for our grandchildren and future generations to come. So the issue for us, and what I'll focus on, is really carbon dioxide, its impact on the ocean, its impacts on the chemistry of the ocean, and acidification. The focus for this talk is broken into several sections. I'll give a brief introduction to myself for those of you who are not familiar with who I am and what I do. And then I'll talk about some of the work we do in Bermuda and then from the Southern Ocean to the Arctic, drawing upon research at sustained time series in the polar regions, coral reefs. And I'll try and segue and interject how this contributes to education, mentorship, futures at ASU with the ASU BIOS partnership. So without much ado, and I'll go through these very quickly, I actually didn't start my academic preparation as an oceanographer. I did a bachelor's in geology and a master's in earth sciences in Canada before I switched to chemical and biological oceanography at the University of Southampton. And I got my PhD in 1995 and a second doctorate in oceanography at the University of Southampton in 2015. I've done a lot of things. I've been an oil exploration geologist in my early career, a long time ago. As Peter mentioned, I'm a senior scientist and director of research at the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences, which is a US not-for-profit organization, has been. And also I'm a professor of marine biogeochemistry, ocean biogeochemistry at the University of Southampton. And that's allowed me to have an ability to have students teach, access to the library, research projects funded in the EU and UK, for example. Now, I've had a lot of grant success, a lot of funding through the federal agencies, particularly the National Science Foundation. So in the last 20 or so years, I've got about 40 million in research dollars funding as a principal investigator or co-PI. And as PI, about 80 million for ship-related funding. And so I'm responsible for the ship at BIOS too. So that's part of my research portfolio, so to speak. My research contributions are major responsibilities for the 2 sustained ocean time series off Bermuda, BATS and Hydrostation S. But I work everywhere, really, from the Arctic to the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, from the Indian Ocean, Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, from coral reefs to open ocean pelagic ecosystems. So it's a very diverse portfolio of research. The key thing about BIOS and my own journey through science is the wonderful benefit of collaboration and colleagues throughout the US and internationally. And part of this is the rationale, because if you share a ship to collect data, you have to share data. And this builds linkages, networks, and collaborations. And that's been a very important part, a component of ocean sciences. And that's been a wonderful opportunity for me personally. At present, I have about 12 and more research projects, mostly funded through the US federal agencies. So that's the National Science Foundation, NOAA, and NASA. And this involves over 60 fellow PIs and co-PIs, principal investigators, and more than 100 collaborators. We have become, as BATS, a nexus for collaboration sampling. And I won't talk a lot about all of these projects, but we have, my group have currently some work in the Arctic, in the Southern Ocean, looking at the Gulf Stream, for example, the Gulf of Maine and acidification in the Gulf of Maine, optical properties in the oceans, looking at corals. FemFem is actually a French government funding for Sargasso Sea work. I work a lot with NOAA colleagues on CO2 observing networks. We have a new science and technology center that's led by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And of course, Hydrostation S and BATS, and Hydro is the longest time series we have. For scholarly contributions, I've published a lot, 170 papers, and also contributed to the IPCC reports. If you're interested in scholarly metrics, my H indexes are listed. But the type of research that I do focuses on ocean carbon, biogeochemistry, ocean physics, ocean ecosystems, systems theory. So it's very wide ranging. As far as education, teaching and mentorship, while BIOS has never been a degree granting institution, through linkages to Duke University and other universities and my current affiliation with University of Southampton, I teach quite a lot of courses, both undergraduate and graduate courses. Have had NSF research experience for undergraduates, MSc students. I currently have a PhD student, Amavi Silva, at the University of Southampton. So it's, you know, when you explore BIOS, you'll find that there is a nexus, a milieu of K through 12, grade 12 to undergraduate, graduate research and education and combined together. So it's, you know, from visiting high school students to summer courses, etc. It's a very busy place in the summer times. And contributions to service, you know, I've served on a lot of committees, IPCC, given oral testimony and written testimony to UK government, for example, been a director of research at BIOS, also a director of BIOS for a year. And I lead the group and run the ship and participated in many committees. So it's quite a full plate. So the focus of the talk for science is really, you know, the oceans of change in this transitional carbon-based world we live in. That's the rise of atmospheric CO2, anthropogenic CO2 that's accumulating in the atmosphere and the climate warming impacts, but also how it changes ocean chemistry and the ocean ecosystems that are functioning in the global ocean, from coastal to the open ocean. And I won't do a lot of chemistry, I promise, but what I wanted to really get across was that carbon dioxide, once it is absorbed into the oceans, doesn't remain as CO2 for just a few seconds. And out of 20 molecules of CO2, 19 of those molecules of CO2 change. They dissociate, they combine with water to form carbonic acid, and then other species in seawater bicarbonate and carbonate, which are very important for calcifying organisms, and they produce CO2. And so we're producing calcium carbonate. Now, this plot on the right is what we call a Bjerrum plot. And so we go from very low concentrations to high concentrations. And in essence, what happens with ocean acidification is we move the system to the left so that we reduce pH. And what that does is change the proportion of bicarbonate to carbonate. It reduces carbonate, and the ability of marine ecosystems, organisms that create shells, tests, etc., to produce calcium carbonate. So acidification is that process of moving that purple line towards the left. It's a sort of misnomer acidification, because the ocean is actually mildly alkaline. So what ocean acidification really is moving the ocean from a more alkaline state to a less alkaline state. Now, for me and my group, we measure inorganic carbon, CO2 system, and seawater. And we measure things, 4 things, essentially. And if we measure 2 of these things, we can calculate, knowing the chemistry of carbonate, CO2 in seawater, the other 2. We measure what we call the dissolved inorganic carbon. We can measure pH. We can measure what we call the partial pressure of CO2 or the fugacity of CO2, and the alkalinity. And from those measurements, whether they're temperature, pressure independent or not, we have a very robust understanding of how they interact with each other. So we make very precise measurements of DIC, less than 0.05%. And that allows us to look at the climate change in ocean carbon that we've observed over the last 40 years. Part of my work is also to contribute to the global carbon cycle, and the Friedlingstein paper, which there's a new version coming out, tells us from our observations that the ocean is taking up about 2.5 petagrams or gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. The land is giving off about 1.6, but it's absorbing about 3.4. So this, in a very simple way, tells you a lot about the fact that things like reforestation, deforestation, soil structure has an impact on the land carbon sink. In the ocean, it's the physics, biology, and what ecosystem structure community is present in the oceans that in fact implicates, carbon in changing ocean chemistry. We try and improve our maps. We pool data and we try and figure out that, okay, the oceans are taking up about 2.5 petagrams, which is about 1/4 to 1/3 of the amount of fossil fuel anthropogenic CO2 that we as humans release to the atmosphere. But it's not absorbed equally everywhere. In the equator, those red areas in the map, in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, these are regions where the ocean is actually giving out CO2 to the atmosphere. And the red and blue areas are where CO2 is going into the ocean. So we try and figure out where the ocean sinks and sources are in the global ocean to figure out the future ocean. It's a predictive role. And the oceans are taking up anthropogenic CO2. And most of that CO2, anthropogenic CO2, by concentration, is occurring in the North Atlantic. That's where most of the physics and biology is facilitating the uptake of anthropogenic CO2 from the atmosphere into the ocean. So we're in an era of ocean change. And a lot of my work is obviously focused on ocean time series. And it really is that while we have lots of new novel ways of observing the ocean, time series, so repeated sustained measurements, long-term observations allow us to robustly say how the oceans are changing. Now, this can involve many different types of observational platforms. We have traditional ships. We can have new sensors underway, sensors, automated underwater vehicles like gliders, moorings. It's a nexus of multiple approaches to observing the ocean. And as we improve sensors and the capabilities of sensors, we really developed the tools to answer a lot more questions about how the oceans are functioning. And a couple of these are, for example, in the Southern Ocean, these new SOCOM floats, which can measure oxygen, pH, for example. And that image of Cleo on the right is Max Sato's new automated instrument for sampling the ocean, which measures thousands of genes, whether they're expressed, on, off, etc. It's an amazing new tool, and we'll see the benefit of it going forward. I'll talk a little bit about bats and Hydrostation S. Hydrostation S is about 25 kilometers southeast of the island of Bermuda, and bats, Bermuda Atlantic time series, is about 80 kilometers to the southeast of the island of Bermuda. I won't go into a lot of detail because essentially we have a lot of work done on cruises every 2 weeks to a month, a lot of physics, chemistry, and biology sampling from the surface ocean to the very deep. And it takes a lot of effort from our dedicated and fantastic team to keep going and making the cruises and making the samples. So Hydrostation S, for example, has been running now since 1954. It is the longest open ocean time series that we have on the planet. And bats, we sample every month, more in the springtime, has been running since 1988, and we've had over 650 cruises. Now, I'm going to show you some figures of science, and one of the ways to do that is to use Hovmöller plots. So in a sense, you condense 40 years, for example, of surface data into one figure. So in the left-hand panel, we have observed data, and it goes from left to right, January to December, and from bottom to top is year. So we go from 1983 to 2020. And so this would be a plot of temperature, and it tells you something about the seasonality of temperature. It's red colors in the summer, it's warm, it's 28 to 30 degrees. It's cooler in the winter, about 18, 19 degrees. And then relative to these data, you can calculate the anomalies relative to the mean, and that gives you some sense of change. So for example, for temperature, the Sargasso Sea, the North Atlantic, is warming from our anomaly data. And what we've found in the last 10 years is that temperatures have increased by 1.12 degrees Celsius. It's also become more stratified. And that really is evidence that in the last 10 years, we've seen, and there are other evidences for this, that the ocean in the North Atlantic has changed in the last 10 years profoundly. That's a lot of warming, a lot of heat content, affects hurricanes, all sorts of implications. If you warm the ocean, you get sea level rise. And we know that the average rise in sea level is about 2.2 millimeters per year from the NOAA tide gauge. But in the last 10 years, it's increased by 10 centimeters, which is about 4 times what the average has been since before 2010, going back decades. We have the data from NOAA, but I thought it would be interesting to also intersect marine archaeology into this. This is a figure of data from what we call Dockyard in Bermuda, which has been there since the 18th century. And it's a stable, been there, physical human structure, and you can see sea level rise relative to that structure and the acceleration in the last 10 years. It's saltier in the North Atlantic, and this is what we call salinification, and it reflects the global reorganization of the water cycle. Where it's raining, where it's dry and there's evaporation, it's getting saltier in the North Atlantic. The ocean is also losing oxygen, and that's because of lower rates of photosynthesis, increased stratification, warming. But we've seen about an 8% decrease in surface oxygen in the last 40 years, 2% per decade. We're also seeing changes in ocean photosynthesis and the biological community growth of the pelagic phytoplankton in the Sargasso Sea. It's decreasing, which is what you would predict from global models of how the oceans are going to respond to warming. So primary production is decreasing, but interestingly, for carbon and understanding the carbon cycle, export is not. We have a traditional model where we think about the oceans and we think large phytoplankton, once they die, they sink, and there's bigger export of carbon, greater transfer of carbon to the deep ocean where it's stored. But the Sargasso Sea is different. We think these smaller cells, these picoplanktons, the pico-nano eukaryotes are sticky. So the cells are sticking together and they're being exported, lost from the surface ocean to the deep. So transferring carbon from the surface ocean to the deep where that carbon is stored for thousands of years, which is a good thing. And I'll come back to this because this will have implications for the coral reefs. The ocean is gaining CO2, and this is about 70% increase in the last 40 years of anthropogenic CO2 in the North Atlantic. And because it's gaining CO2, if we go look at the pH anomalies, we have all of these reds and we're going to greens and blues. What that's telling you is that pH is decreasing. And when pH decreases, you increase the amount of what we call protons, hydrogen ion, in the ocean. So in effect, the ocean acidity has increased by about 40% in the last 40 years, which will have and has had profound implications for calcifying ecosystems in the ocean. I said I'd talk about corals, and we have a long record of coral calcification and what we call net ecosystem metabolism in Bermuda. It goes back nearly 20, 25 years. And one of the interesting things is that seasonally, the coral reef of Bermuda, like other reefs, like the Florida Reef now at the present state, undergoes dissolution in the February to May period. That did not happen in the 1980s or the 1990s. This is a new phenomenon, and the reef system in Bermuda, healthy as it may be, and there's lots of good coral cover, is in fact experiencing the impact of ocean acidification and dissolution of the reef, which makes it more vulnerable to tropical cyclones, wave action. And with colleagues, we think that there's a very complex interaction between corals, photosynthesis, respiration, and very large, gyre-wide physical changes, things like the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is similar in a sense to the El Nino Southern Oscillation in the Pacific. If we look a little bit deeper, we are a window of observation for changes outside of the North Atlantic, in the Labrador Sea, in the Arctic, and in the Southern Ocean. As waters pass through the deeper layers of the ocean, they pass Bermuda, and we have been measuring them for the last 50 to 60 years. And what we've seen is a cooling. This is Labrador Sea water. So in the right-hand panels, you'll see the decrease in temperature and the sort of the freshening of the ocean. So the windows of observation, and what this data from Bermuda is telling you is that, okay, Labrador Sea is getting colder and it's getting fresher. And that's because of changes in the Arctic. And as you are probably very well aware, we've seen large changes in the summertime minimum sea ice extent. So we used to have a lot of sea ice in the winter, in the summer. In winter, it will cover a much broader region. And today we see a lot less sea ice, and it's freshening, it's warming. And there are a lot of positive and negative feedbacks in the Arctic, from sea ice albedo, heat uptake, climate change. So there are lots of positive amplifications of temperature in the Arctic. So global warming will be felt more readily in the Arctic, and you see that in the observational data sets, that it is warming faster than other regions. And so there's a complex issue of feedbacks that we have to figure out in the Arctic. And we have a new NSF project called the Synoptic Arctic Survey, which is a collaboration between many countries: Japan, China, Korea, Russia, Canada, Denmark, the US, Norway. And our section will be up here in what we call the Western Arctic and the region of maximum sea ice loss, looking at how sea ice loss has changed the physics, the chemistry, and biology of the Arctic. Because the Arctic is greening, it's becoming a sink for CO2. It's increased from a contribution of less than 1% to the global carbon sink to maybe 5 to 6% in the last 30 years. And as you can see by the figure, there's lots of complex interactions between what we call sea ice, open water, melt ponds. There's a whole slew of positive and negative feedbacks with regard to just CO2 and obviously biology as well. So that's sort of some of the examples of what we do at BIOS and bats and how it's connected to the Arctic. But we have lots of other projects. My group has projects related to the global carbon budget. You know, how do we better predict the future for ocean CO2? And part of that is looking at the microbial planet, essentially, the ocean microbes, the viruses and bacteria within this new NSF Science and Technology Center. The important thing to note is that photosynthesis by ocean phytoplankton, about 50% of that organic carbon that's produced by photosynthesis returns to CO2 within hours to days. If there are changes in that community and the process of returning organic carbon back to CO2, that's another feedback to the climate system that we know very little about. And so this project is really trying to figure out how organic carbon is modulating CO2 uptake and loss from the ocean going forward. And CCOMP, which is the Center for Chemical Currencies of Microbial Planet, is a combination of many research and educational activities. So there's models, there's data collection, there's a lot of eDNA, genome, molecular biology work. There's embedded within that the K through 12 classroom experiences, what we call cures, VIPs, which are vertically integrated programs, which are research programs, internships, bridge to PhD. So it's really trying to fit very intricately together research and education. And as part of the STC, we'll use the ship, the Explorer, which is based at BIOS, and allows us to get into the deep ocean very easily. And there are other projects such as Bioscope, which is funded by the Simons International Foundation, to Craig Carlson and Steve Giovannoni. And that is another molecular biology research foci, and trying to understand the molecular biology of the oceans. So in a sense that I showed you 12 projects that are active right now with the federal agencies that my group is involved with. And I think part of the interaction with ASU and this real partnership and bringing together, finding common ground, common research ground, the opportunities are going to be amazing and as yet evolving. And I don't know if any of us can really predict where it will go, but what it will do is to embed and augment our existing strengths in oceanography at BIOS. So for myself, in addition to the 12 research projects, we could think about gene to gyre, looking at genes on diel to seasonal to yearly variability across the gyre. This involves the STC, Bioscope, a lot of other research initiatives that we're planning. We have Arctic, Atlantic work, a project we call Bermuda to Bear Islands, B2B. We should be thinking about what we call a Center for Alkalization Studies at BIOS and ASU. And that is a sense of testing and experimenting to find out what happens when you actually add alkalinity to ocean ecosystems to reverse the impact of CO2. An IOF Bermuda, for example, would be an integrated ocean future, which is model-based, data-driven. Ocean SIS, which is ocean carbon instruments, systems and sensors. That's a really big need in oceanography. And in a maybe more minor way, Bermuda is an amazing place to actually collect seawater and develop seawater standards, which are crucial for developing good data to assess ocean change. So there's a lot of research plans and opportunities that we can think about. And BIOS, and this is an introduction to the talks you'll get from other bioscientists. We know we can come up with lots of themes about research and coordinated research and integrated research. Number one is gene regulation, for example, coastal ocean processes, coral reefs, education and mentorship, new tools, sensors, number 4, ocean observation, number 5, environmental change, number 6. And essentially what we're trying to think about is taking these research themes, doing synthesis, prediction, policy to global policy reports and implications. So in essence, this triangle of opportunity to do interdisciplinary ocean science drives policy, policy changes, cultural shifts, funding reallocation to support transformations in research initiatives and projects. For education, I'm very keen on thinking about enabling tools and technologies, ETTs, for example, and they're the linkage points between science and education outreach activities and objectives. And I've mentioned a couple of these before: CURES, which are course-based undergraduate research experiences; VIPs, which are vertically integrated projects. We're thinking outside of the box, open to lots of ways of thinking about improving student student outcomes, MOOCs, hybrid learning, embedding research projects into education fundamentally as a learning tool, experiential capstone experiences, for example. And, we can put it together in this kind of, you can add lots of things here, but obviously if you have targeted education, mentorship, outreach, you can improve ocean appreciation, policies for sustainability, STEM and science literacy. And what feeds into that educational initiative is novel observations and instrumentations, improved data models. When you can get your students to run a model of the Atlantic or an ocean that they're interested in a day using a NASA predictive modeling approach, it's transformational. And big data, physics and biology, bioinformatics. And obviously we have to think about meta and AI initiatives going forward in the next 10 to 20 years, which will transform the way people learn about their planet. And so this is really a sense of what we do and what my group and I do at BIOS, getting students out to see to the corals, to the mangrove, having lots of undergraduate and graduate research experiences. And we hope that we'll have much more capstone field experience, experiential learning, which will improve student outcomes going forward. And I should stop right there. So thanks and questions.
Hello, so I'm Nikki Kittleson, Associate Dean in the College of Global Futures, and I will be posing questions to you, Nick, so I'm sure you can hear me. The first question is, if I understand correctly, the ocean has become a carbon sink, which could potentially mitigate climate change. But increased carbon would increase the acidification process and increase salt level in the ocean, which has negative impacts on ocean ecosystem. Is this correct?
Yes, it's not a simple. Yes, it's not a simple story. In the past, before humans actually impacted the CO2 level of the atmosphere, the oceans were actually a carbon source, just a small amount, and that was due to rivers adding organic carbon and bacteria and viruses working that organic carbon back to CO2. But today, as CO2 increases, yes, it's taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, mitigating to a certain extent atmospheric CO2 and climate change perturbation. But the trade-off is that uptake of anthropogenic CO2 changes ocean chemistry and facilitates ocean acidification. So it's a double-edged sword.
Second part of the question was about the optimal balance.
Sorry?
The second part of that question was about the optimal balance.
I would say do not produce anthropogenic CO2. That reduces, obviously that's the target, and we have a lot of issues whether it will be 1.5 or 2 degrees warming or whatever it will be by end of century, is to reduce the amount of CO2 we emit, and that will reduce the amount of ocean acidification that is imparted by that release of fossil fuel CO2. So it's a complex question, because you can think about ocean carbon sinks, iron fertilization experiments where you're trying to increase the ocean carbon sink, but that also manifests itself in negative ramifications of doing such an experiment. You change the ocean ecosystem, you may increase the amount of oxygen loss, and acidification. So it's a difficult balance, and I don't have the profound answer to what would be the best balance, except to say that we just have to reduce the amount of anthropogenic CO2 we produce.
Ruff asks, how were the global maps of ocean CO2 uptake and emission produced? What kind of measurement technique was used?
So those maps were produced by about 40 years of data from ships and what we call volunteer observing ships. So they could be merchant vessels, research vessels, and they have an intake at the bow and they take in surface seawater from about 1 meter to 3 meters deep. And that's passed through tubing in the ship to a lab or a place in the engine room in some ships where we measure the amount of CO2 that's contained in that seawater. And then that data is uploaded to what we call the Surface Ocean Carbon Atlas, SOCAT. And I like the acronym SOCAT because I like cats and I have lots of cats. So it allows you to generate maps of ocean CO2 uptake, sinks and sources every year, or a climatological average over the last 10 years, for example. So what kind of measurement technique is used is typically what we call an infrared chemical analyzer. So it allows you to determine the concentration of CO2 within an air parcel passing through the instrument. And so it's very much like the global atmospheric CO2 measurements that have been made. So Dave Keeling started in Bermuda, in Hawaii, and also measured in Bermuda many years ago in the 1950s. And that was the first indication that atmospheric CO2 was changing both seasonally, up and down with the seasons, winter and summer, and over a long term, from a measurement of 310 back in 1950s to more than 400 parts per million today.
Can you talk more about virtual opportunities for ASU students to participate in oceanographic research at BIOS?
It would be a fantastic thing to do. I think also have actual opportunities to go on a ship and understand, feel this experience deep within, and how that can transform a person and what you think your future career can be. Virtual opportunities, ASU is fantastic for developing virtual opportunities, and it will only get better. So we could envisage having, and we've run this for Oxford University for their course on oceanography. During COVID, they weren't able to get out to Bermuda, and so we did a lot of filming at sea and a lot of blogs, and that really helped them get a sense of the experience. And I think as we get more sophisticated and we think about what resources we can sort of use to bring that experience of being at sea, what you do, I think we're going to see that develop with ASU soon. And there will be lots of opportunities to see it virtually, but also if we'll hopefully have capstone experiences where a few students will be able to go to sea and experience what it's like. The same is true for coral reefs. I mean, we can develop virtual programs, virtual projects for exploring coral reefs and the difficult issues that coral reefs health is facing.
Thank you. I've focused on some of the questions in the Q&A, and I wonder if in the room, if there were anyone who wanted to ask a question aloud in the room, if I had maybe not seen any hands or anything in here.
Maybe just, I'm not sure if this can be heard. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Sort of an addition to that question about, is the ocean a source or a sink? Of course, it was a source in the past, but it can turn into a source again. If we start to pull down the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is part of what people think has to happen and most likely will happen, at that point, the ocean will become a source again. And that is something that we have to take into consideration as we are looking at how much CO2 we have to pull out of the atmosphere, because in a way we also have to pull some back out of the ocean.
Yes,
so that's an interesting question moving forward in regulating the atmospheric concentration of CO2 to keep the temperature at below 2, maybe 1.5. The targets are a little bit out of reach right now. We try to get back into that bracket, but that will pull some of the CO2 back out of the ocean.
Yeah, and I think that will depend on a lot of things. You know, we are in a transitional carbon-based world, and yes, if we could get the oceans back to being a CO2 source, we'd be in a post-carbon world, which would be good.
Well, any other questions that anyone wants to pose in the Q&A? I don't see any that we've missed in the chat. Looks like those are all the questions for today. Thank you so much, Nick. We really appreciate your talk and your careful answer to our questions. And thank you.
Thanks so much.